Hey folks, I'm Mark Ryan. This is Super Review, and this is the Kinda Lava. So the Kinda Lava is an IM. It's a collaboration between manufacturer Letshuoer and fellow IM reviewer HBB, who you might better know as Bad Guy Good Audio Reviews. And well, what they did, this actually came out, I want to say back in February, something like that. And what they did was they collaborated on a retune of the Letshuoer EJ07M, which it's not a very catchy name, but it's an IM. It's a Tribrid IM that came out last year, along with, frankly, a number of Tribrid IMs that came out last year. And to some degree, it flew a little bit under the radar, especially for me. But I did get a chance to hear the original EJ07M earlier this year, thanks to Precog. And honestly, I was pretty impressed with it. And so when I found out that HBB had worked on a collab with Letshuoer to do a slight retune of it, and the retune is very much focused in sort of the bass region, which we'll talk more about. Basically, the bass on the original EJ07M is kind of like your typical Harman sub-bass shelf, whereas the bass curve on this is more integrated into the mid-bass, and if I'm honest, like that's kind of what I prefer. So that got me pretty interested in the Kinda Lava. Now, this is not a cheap iPhone. IM. This is not a cheap earphone. This is a $670 IM, which is, you know, it's definitely up there in price, but I really wanted to spend some time living with the Kinda Lava, comparing it to some of my other favorites in this price range, which probably not going to be surprised, the Sennheiser IE600, the Moondrop S8, and those are the IMs I'm going to spend today comparing with the Kinda Lava. So, like all my other reviews, this is a live stream. If you're watching now live, you have any questions about the Kinda Lava, the S8, 600, whatever we're talking about today, leave it in the live chat. At the end of the review, we'll have some time for a back and forth conversation, and hopefully I can answer all of your questions. Otherwise, shout out to Linsole for sending this in for review. I do have a link to them in the description down below, but without further ado, let's dive to the table and start talking about, well, first we'll talk about what comes inside the box, and then we'll start talking about the sound. So, what comes inside the box? First of all, this is the packaging for the Kinda Lava. As I alluded to, this is a retune of the EJ07M, which sounds a bit more like a Star Wars robot, but is in fact an IM. And what you get inside the box is what you see here. We'll put the IM a bit to the side for now and show off this little carry case, which is frankly really nicely done. This is a metal carry case with a screw top lid. That sound probably is awful on camera. I apologize. But there are a number of IMs. Okay, I'm gonna stop that. There are a number of IMs that come with metal cases, and I don't know, don't always love them. This one actually has a really nice feel to it. I think part of it is that it's got this silicone ring at the bottom of it, so that every time I set it down on a table, it just feels extra solid, almost like it's like magnetically attaching to the table. I don't know. It's a very nicely built case. I'll just leave it at that. Otherwise, the accessories are fairly straightforward. You do get, you know, a multitude of tips. You get a full set of foam tips. And I'll be honest, I didn't use these at all. And then you also get two different styles of silicone tips. We'll punch in on those just for posterity, but not much to see in these. I would say that the black ones here, the walls are a little bit on the thinner side. Kind of remind me of the Sennheiser IE600 walls, which is, I don't know, not necessarily a good thing, but I honestly didn't even really try them too much. I did start with these tips, although as you might notice, I don't have either of these sets on here, and we will talk about that in a bit. Otherwise, that's going to bring us to the earphone itself. We'll talk about this cable. If this cable looks familiar to you, well, it definitely looks familiar to me, because this feels like it's almost exactly the same cable that we saw on the recently reviewed Tin Hi-Fi P1 Max and the recently reviewed Thea Audio Elixir. It's just a very, very familiar color and shape. Two cores, kind of a copper color. I would say, as you might notice, that it's a little bit memory prone, a little bit on the kinky side, but otherwise, I don't know, it's a decent cable. I just feel like, you know, at this price range, it would be nice to have a little bit more of a robust, nicer cable. In fact, Letshuoer's got another IM coming out pretty soon that's much cheaper than the EJ07M, and this is the cable it comes with, and I think this cable's better. So, Letshuoer, if you're listening to me, I would suggest putting this cable in the box of the Kinda Lava instead of that cable. Although, again, this cable's perfectly fine. I'll give it the roadie wrap. You can see actually real quickly the hardware in here is nice and small, and it does actually have a functional chin slider. You might notice that it is not moving itself around, which I appreciate. But otherwise, you got, you know, your preformed ear hooks up here and your fairly standard 2-pin connectors. The 2-pin connectors are basically a flush mount. You can see there's no recession or anything like that, but I had zero issues with stability of the connectors here. And that's going to bring us to talking about the earpieces themselves, which are kind of like I'm guessing some sort of an anodized aluminum or something like that. Honestly, it's been a while since I've seen an IM with colored aluminum shells like this. I think the last time I can recall would be something like the BGVP DMG. That was a review from a way back when. But the shells are generally, I'd say, well made. They are, you know, they've got that metal material. Give it a little clink test. And they are actually pretty lightweight. What I will say about these though is, I don't know, in terms of aesthetics, I think that it does look a little bit half-baked. They've basically got what looks like kind of like a carbon fiber, a very thin carbon fiber layer that is covered in a very thin layer of lacquer. And it just looks, I don't know. I don't think it looks bad, I'll be honest, but it doesn't look like a $700 IM, if I'm perfectly honest there. So, I don't know. Aesthetically, I think it's okay. I do like the fact that it's red and it's different than a lot of other IMs. But I do think that they could have done a little bit more to create more contrast, I think, on that faceplate where, currently with that dark color on the red with the lacquer, it makes it difficult to see the pattern, except for when I've got the light shining on it like this, in which case you kind of see that the quality of that lacquer finish is a little bit lacking. Anyway, let's talk about how these things fit. So I mentioned that I'm not using the stock tips, and that's actually related to the fit. But as I talk about it, I'll give you a bit of a fit demonstration so you can see how it fits in my ear. Size-wise, I would say that the collab'd is very squarely in the medium size range. So this is not a very large IM, but it's also not like the smallest IM. It's not like a bullet shape or anything like that. It's, I would say, probably a little bit smaller than something like a Moondrop Kato or Moondrop Aria, if you've got that as a reference. But otherwise, I don't know. That's how it fits. Now, how it fits might be a little bit of an issue. Not in terms of the ingress egress, as you saw, that was really easy to do. And definitely not in terms of comfort, because it's got all smooth edges and stuff around it. Have zero issues with comfort with this IM, but fit security can be a little bit of a pain. We'll go down here real quickly. You can just kind of see that the back of the shell does have a little bit of molding to it, but for the most part, this is not a super custom molded IM like something like the Moondrop S8. So, as I was alluding to, I actually had a little bit of difficulty with fit security on this IM. It would just kind of come loose over time. And usually when that happens, the first thing we'll go to is I will go to swapping ear tips. And that's why you will see that I'm not using the stock ear tips. In fact, I'm using spin fits. These are CP100s, if you're curious about it. These for me, they just extend the nozzle, you know, a couple of millimeters. And that for me is enough to get a really nice, stable fit. Interestingly enough, when I was switching over to that other Letshuoer cable, let me pull this one in just for reference, I actually found that this also slightly improved the fit stability. The difference being, you can kind of see like the cable that comes with stock has somewhat of an aggressive, very sharp and abrupt curve on it. And what that means is that as it's going around my ear, punch in again on that, you just see it's hugging pretty tightly against the top of my ear. Now that's going to be, you know, different for pretty much everybody depending on the size of your ear, but I did find switching to that other cable just basically push this out a little bit further. How do I do it? It pushed this out a little bit further so there was more clearance for my ear, and it seemed like there was just then less pressure, potentially pushing and rotating the IM forward and disrupting the fit. So if you are using an EJ07M, a collab'd, either version of them, and you have issues with the fit security, my recommendations would be try out CP100 tips from SpinFit, and then also try out a cable that's got somewhat of a taller 2-pin connector like this that can give you that added clearance. Okay, I think that is as much as I have to say about the physical stuff. Let me wrap this up once more, and then we'll dive into talking about the sound here on the Kinda Lava. And like I typically do, we'll start by talking about the sound signature, and then we'll talk about what I like about the sound and what are the things that maybe I don't love about the sound, because I've always got something to complain about, right? So the general sound signature on this, I would describe squarely as neutral with a very, very tasteful bass boost. Honestly, frankly, I was pretty surprised at the tastefulness of the bass boost. Look, HBB, the reviewer that retuned this IM, it's no secret, he likes a lot of bass, and I really expected the Kinda Lava to probably be a little bit too much bass for me. But if I'm perfectly honest, it's definitely a bass boosted IM. No bones about that. But as far as like degrees of bass boost, I think it's just about perfect. So this definitely does have a bass boost in it, but versus the EJ07M, that bass boost is not entirely sub-bass focused. It's a little bit thicker in, actually I would say considerably thicker in the mid bass. So what that gives you is it gives you a little bit of a bass boost, but it also gives me what I like as far as a neutral mid-range tuning. Like honestly, if you look at this thing versus my my neutral target, the mid-range is basically bang on. So you get a not overly lean mid-range. You do get a little bit of forwardness in it, but to be honest, I do think that the tuning, the tonality here on the Kinda Lava comes across with somewhat of a downward sloping sound signature. Like it sounds a little bit darker and less forward than it graphs, which was a bit of a curiosity. I don't know. I'm not going to attempt to explain that right now, but what I will say is that, yeah, it just comes across slightly, I don't know if I want to say dark, but definitely safe in the treble region. So the treble on this IM, I would say, is very well extended. You'll see that on a frequency response graph, and it isn't maybe necessarily that it comes across as dark sounding, but it slightly dark sounding, but more to the point, I think really just the treble is very, very safe. If you're at all treble sensitive, I don't think you're going to have an issue here with the Kinda Lava. So now we'll maybe just quickly touch on some of the ways that this is very specifically different from the original EJ07M. Again, there is that bass difference that I described. What that means for the sound is that I think the original EJ07M comes across a little bit more clinical, maybe even a little bit more contrasty, which is interesting. I think the bass on the Kinda Lava is a little bit better integrated into the sound, where the bass on the original can kind of come across a little bit subwoofery. Like if you listen to a sound system that has a really overpowering subwoofer, it stands out as its own distinct speaker, I suppose, in the system, where here, again, I think the bass comes across a little bit more integrated into the rest of the sound. I do get a little bit more body on things like kick drums and stuff, which frankly I appreciate. But if I'm perfectly honest, in head-to-head comparison with the stock, the original EJ07M, I was surprised that the difference was more subtle than I expected. If you look at it on a frequency response, and I do have that linked on Squig Link in the description down below, you look at the frequency response, it looks like a pretty stark difference in the bass tuning, and definitely it is, but in terms of the actual listening experience, I was actually surprised that it wasn't that different. Maybe another way to say that is, if you've already got the EJ07M, the stock one, I don't know that I would go out and buy another one, because it's different. And we'll talk, and okay, I don't know if I was ready to say this, but I will say I do like this a little bit better than the stock one. But it's not like wildly different. Okay, so with that out of the way, let's talk about what do I like about the sound here on the EJ07M Kinda Lava. Honestly, that tonality that I described, I love it. I love it. It's very mid-range focused with that really good, strong bass boost in it. Again, it does sound somewhat darker than it graphs, but it still gives you excellent mid-range clarity. The treble in this I mentioned is well extended, which it is, and that contributes to, I think, really good sounding timbre on things like cymbals and hi-hats, drum brushes. All that high frequency percussion sounds super natural, well extended and full here on the Kinda Lava. But again, the treble is actually really safe on this set. So if you are treble sensitive, you're worried about stuff like that, you're not going to have to be worried about here. treble on this set. Especially where this was really stand out for me is with my sibilance test tracks. That, you know, there's music that just has, it's sibilant in its recording. The kind of lava honestly deals with them, I would say, excellently. Outstanding performance with sibilance tracks. Back to the mid-range, I would say that, you know, you do get actually a really good sense of that micro contrast, and I attribute that a lot to the quality of the tuning of the mid-range, as well as the well-extended treble. Yeah, it just gives you a really good sense of that micro contrast, good texture that plays across, and, you know, instruments and stuff that all play through the mid-range. But I think especially for me, what I like is vocals, and you get that vocal. If there's like a gravelly texture in a vocal, a breathiness or anything like that, it comes across really, really well detailed here on the Kind of Lava. And then the other thing that I really like about the Kind of Lava is the bass. Oh my, oh my. This is like, it might be, no joke, like one of the top 2 or 3 bass performances I've heard in an IM, and I've heard definitely stuff that costs more than this, so that's pretty high praise. I love the bass on this stuff. It's nice and firm. It's got a nice sense of wallop, but it's never overbearing. You get a really well-defined sense of attack, and enough of a resonant decay to kind of give it that sense of realism, but without any hint of blurring or smeariness or anything like that. And I think honestly the bass on this, it gives it a nice sense of depth to the sound field. And frankly, I just find it pretty addicting. So that's what I love about the sound here on the Kind of Lava. What are the things maybe I don't love about it? Well, like I mentioned about that tonality kind of coming across a little bit on the downward sloping side. I would say that gives the mid-range and just the sound in general a little bit less of an open, airy sound that I like. Most of the times it sounds basically normal, but I guess where that slightly disrupted open and airiness comes into play is like with the album Disintegration by The Cure. I mentioned this a lot as an album I like to test with. That's just an album that the more open and airy your IM is, like, it's just going to sound better. And I would say versus a lot of some other IMs, I did find that was one album that the Kind of Lava didn't quite nail. In a related point, I would say that the head stage on this set is somewhat on the narrow side. Now, I'm not one to really talk too much about soundstage in IMs that often. Usually it's like about average soundstage. Sometimes it's considerably above average and it's worth calling out. And sometimes it's a little bit below average and that's worth calling out. And I think that's honestly where the Kind of Lava sits a little bit. Again, not my highest priority in sound, but definitely to the point that it's worth calling out, especially for folks that, you know, a lot of times people were asking me specifically about soundstage IMs, and that's definitely not going to be the Kind of Lava. What else can I nitpick on this thing? You know, I mentioned the treble in this is definitely in the safe side. If I'm talking strictly about the quality of the treble, there is an interesting, it's not necessarily offensive, but there is an interesting texture to the treble. I don't know if it's, I'm not an IM designer, but maybe it's related to the fact that this thing is using 4 ESTs. I didn't actually cover the driver configuration, but yeah, this is using 4 ESTs for the treble, and it just kind of gives it a sense of like almost like a soft sandiness to it. Not quite a gritty texture, but almost like I don't know. It's interesting. I'll just say that it stands out a little bit. It's not perfectly natural sounding there in the treble, but again, it's never offensive. So I'm only kind of mentioning this as a nitpick. And then I guess, again, as a nitpick, worth complaining about, I suppose, is that it's surprisingly not that different from the original EJ07M. Again, in A/B listening and head-to-head comparisons, you know, there were definitely some standout differences. Overall, I did prefer this to the original, but as a retuning, I don't know, kind of expected it to sound a little bit more different. So those are my general thoughts here on the Kind of Lava. But let's put it into context by comparing it with some other IMs that I've got in roughly this price range. And we'll talk about how they compare in terms of sound signature, tuning, and all that jazz as I slide them into view. All right. So what we've got here on the table. Obviously, we've got the Letshuoer Cross HBB Kinda Lava. This is $670. I mentioned it's a tribrid, which means it's got one dynamic driver for the bass, two balanced armatures, and then four EST drivers covering the mid-range and treble. I'm not gonna make claims about exactly where it's at, but that's the configuration there. Total of 7 drivers. Here we've got the Moondrop S8. This is a $700 IM, and it is an all balanced armature set. It's got 8 balanced armatures, but that's it. It's not a hybrid or a tribrid, it's just an all BA set. And then over here, we've got the Sennheiser IE600, also $700. So these are all very much, I think, in the same ballpark, although you will find the Kinda Lava on sale pretty often, which is interesting. But the IE600, unlike these two, is a single driver IM. So it's just got one dynamic driver. Okay, so how do these things compare in terms of tuning? Just the general sound signature stuff. So like I mentioned here with the Kinda Lava, it's neutral with bass boost. I think it's a very balanced sound signature. If anything, I could say maybe it's slightly on the downward sloping, somewhat dark sound signature side. Generally just pretty safe though, and fairly midsy. Here with the Sennheiser IE600 on the other hand, very, very different tuning. I would describe this as a V-shaped tuning. If, again, you could call it a U-shaped tuning if you wanted to be charitable, I suppose. It does have actually a really nicely tuned mid-range, but mostly this is about the bass and fairly aggressive treble here on the IE600. And then over here on the Moondrop S8, this tuning is pretty squarely in the Harman neutral side, which means that mid-range is very much neutral to somewhat forward, and the lower mid-range being a little bit thin, and the bass boost being primarily focused in the sub-bass region. So of the three, I would say this is kind of like the brightest, most open sounding. This is kind of like mostly in the middle, and then this is the most aggressive V-shaped sound signature. So in terms of, let's say, technical performance, some of the not quite frequency response differences between these things. So the Kinda Lava, honestly, the thing that's really stand out about this thing is the bass. I think the mid-range resolution and texture is also really outstanding here on the Kinda Lava, but it is the bass that is the standout aspect here. Again, you just get a really nice sense of firmness, never blurry or smeary or anything like that. Just really, really quite impressed with the bass here. On the topic of technicalities, though, it is worth calling out that I would say that, you know, imaging on this is pretty decent, I suppose, but the head stage is definitely the most narrow of the bunch here, if that is a priority for you. Whereas the IE600, I would say this honestly has, I think, a pretty good sense of head stage. And honestly, I just find it like a really satisfying level of incisiveness across the frequency response. So a lot of that comes from that fairly edgy treble tuning, which can be maybe a little bit on the aggressive side, but honestly, I find it pretty addicting in its own right. Again, gives a nice sense of incisiveness and definition to pretty much everything from, you know, guitar strums to, you know, even bass impact. That treble edge will play a part in that. And you also still get really good sense of bass texture. I think, you know, maybe versus this one, you get a little bit less of that kick drum sort of kick and punch, but maybe a little bit better, more of a liquidy sense of texture to the sub bass here on the IE600. And then that will leave us to talking about the Moondrop S8, where I think this thing is standout, is in its mid-range resolution. Just the mid-range, and this is the mid-range champ of, frankly, a bunch of IEMs, if I'm honest. It also has, I think, excellent head stage. I would say of the bunch, like, this has probably got the biggest head stage, although, I don't know, you're somewhat splitting hairs there. And also really, really smooth treble. You know, it is a little bit on the bright side, but I don't think anyone's going to have issues with this treble being too aggressive. Whereas the treble here in the 600, it's definitely worth a warning about. Where this is probably weakest is going to be actually in the bass, and that's where these two are really quite strong. The bass here, because, well, I'm going to say because it's an all balanced armature bass, It doesn't have quite that sense of body and texture that these two do. I do think the base here is actually pretty good for balanced armature base, but that's definitely a caveat. It's good for balanced armature base, where these are just outstanding base. And then finally, I will talk about these things, how they compare in terms of form factor. And well, let's start with the kind of lava. Again, like I described, I struggled somewhat with the fit of this IM, but honestly, I did solve those struggles with the tip swap and the cable swap. So really no complaints with that. I'm able to go through a night with these things in my ear, and like I'll sleep with these things and they'll still be in my ear in the morning. So that's good. I think aesthetically it probably looks the cheapest to my eye. You know, they are a nice all metal shell, but the aesthetic on it is not quite to my taste. So there you go. Whereas here with the IE600, I think this is a beautiful IEM. Let's punch in on this thing. Let's look at it up close. You do have like this, it's like a 3D printed all metal shell. I think I love the texture in it. I just think they really nailed the aesthetic on this thing. And then obviously, as you can probably tell, this is a very tiny IM, which plays well into fit comfort and honestly even fit security. This thing's really no slouch. Now the one caveat here, again, I switched tips on this because this thing came with pretty awful ear tips, but there you go. And then finally, we'll talk about the Moondrop S8, which I gotta say, form factor wise, is gonna be my favorite of the bunch. Aesthetically, this is my preference. You can pick your preference of the bunch, but aesthetically, I think this is just about perfect for an IM. I love this look, but maybe even more to the point, I just love how this thing fits in my ear. Very, very solid fit security. This is an IM that, I don't know, I could probably play a game of basketball or something and I wouldn't lose my seal with the S8. Maybe my only complaint with the S8 is that the cable it comes with is probably the cheapest of the bunch. But as you can see, I've replaced it. So I think that's going to do it for my thoughts here on the kind of lava, although I do have to, I think, give this thing a score. So, you know, I thought about this thing for a long time because I got this thing a little over a month ago. I got this back in May. I've been listening to it since then. And I was really impressed with it and like kind of struggling. Like, should I give another 5-star IM review after I just gave one to the IE600? And so last week I was actually out of town. I took both the IE600 and the kind of lava with me. And I just spent some time listening to them back to back to back. And honestly, like, I like this one so much, I'm still going to give this one 5 stars out of 5. This is, I think, a fantastic IM and actually a really good complement to both the S8 and the IE600. They all do kind of different things, and where I think this excels is just in balance. It's a really well-tuned mid-range with safe but detailed treble and just really outstanding quality bass. If that sounds like what you want, I do recommend the kind of lava, but also still recommend the others. So make your decision wisely. If you're interested in checking out the kind of lava, though, of course, I got a link in the description down below. And while you're down there fishing around for that link, if you happen to go by the like button, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, ding the YouTube bell, and I'll catch you live on the next super review. Unless you're here live now, in which case, stay put. Let's have a chat.